When I was a reporter, there was a woman who committed sati. And then I found out that she was actually talked into, brainwashed into, and finally forced
And
into.
which
I was researching another story in the hills of Nepal when I came across rows of villages with missing girls.
Mhm.
And I asked the men drinking tea and playing cards where the girls were. And some of them responded and said, "Don't you know they are in Mumbai?" I followed the trail and I found little girls locked up in small rooms with iron bars on the window for years when I was filming. So a man walked in then and he pulled a knife at my throat. Because what we do is that we still write about sexual assault and sexual violence, but there are so many other things that women have to experience, go through, or deal with. Once the kids were ready for school, the principal of the local school said, "No, no, no, I can't admit children are prostitutes." Mela ground on the other
ah,
side, where a fair comes annually for
and that's where the girls are sold,
where the girls are auctioned
auctioned.
off. And the traffickers would actually jump over the walls in our hostel and kidnap the girls.
I Kick and I Fly. That is one inspirational book. And yes, today I have with me on How Did You podcast Professor Ruchira Gupta. Welcome to the show. So, my first question to you is, how did you kick and fly in your life?
It's wonderful to be chatting with you, Smriti. And how did I kick and fly? I was always a rebel, even as a 12-year-old.
Uh huh.
And, I hated domesticity. I wanted an equal world for girls, even then, though I did not know what feminism was. And we had home science classes in school. I wanted to be somehow banned from those classes.
Uh huh.
So I poured kerosene into the frying pan and literally almost burned the school down.
Oh my
And I was
God.
expelled from the class. And I
Seriously.
never, seriously, seriously. And so that was my first act of rebellion. And it stood me in good stead because I learned that I could take things to the brink and still succeed. And, growing up in Calcutta, it was a city full of writers and poets and social change activists. I was inspired by them. And I thought that I too would be a writer who would use my art to make a difference. So, possibly that's my journey that at age 12, I was a rebel. By age 14, I decided my rebellion would take the form of writing. And by age 20, I had joined a local newspaper in Calcutta. And so I would go to college from the time I was in college. I would go from 9 to 3 in the afternoon to college and 3 to 11 to the newspaper office.
My goodness. So you had your days packed way back then. So there must have been so many incidents that you saw and you wanted to write about when you were that young. And maybe you didn't have the opportunity to do so because, of course, we know there are a lot of instances where you cannot write about certain issues. So did you face such things and how did you handle that?
I always wanted to write about children's issues because Calcutta was full of kids living on the sidewalks. And I would see them living inside pipes, those construction
Yes.
pipes, and begging on the streets. And I also saw women treated quite badly. They were refugee women. The Bangladesh war had just got over, and the streets were full of people. But there was hardly any writing about them, except, of course, hunger. And hunger was a big thing that people wrote about. And so when I joined the Telegraph, I would try to insert into my own reportage the woman's voice. So if I would go to cover caste conflict in Bihar, I would actually interview a woman and make sure her quote was in it.
Uh-huh.
If I went to cover the armed struggles in the Northeast, I would make sure that I wrote it from the point of view of a woman who was affected by the armed struggle. Because very soon I realized, even in the newspaper that I worked in, that what affected men was considered political and what affected women was considered cultural.
Huh.
And I wanted to change that norm, of course.
And do you think that you have been able to make at least a dent?
I think I have, along with hundreds and thousands of women across the world, because we all were pushing and we all were breaking the glass ceiling in our own corners of the world, and we reached a tipping point. It's not enough. Even now, I know there is a pay gap between what men
Yes.
earn and women earn. I know that in leadership positions, there are fewer women than men. So, few women editors or women who are taking the lead anywhere, even in politics. So we still need to push forward for that. And also, women's issues are still not covered adequately, because what we do is that we still write about sexual assault and sexual violence, but there are so many other things that women have to experience, go through, or deal with. For example, we've just had a budget out, right?
Yes.
And 61% money has been cut of university grants commission budget. And one of the things which is going to be most impacted by that is all the gender studies departments in
True.
all the universities. Now, how will that affect women? It will affect women because all the research which was being done on feminization of poverty, on how women are dealing with inflation to keep the home kitchen going, all these things will not be reported on.
So earlier you had said that you, along with so many others, have definitely made a change. So how did you bring about that change in your journalistic career? I mean, were there stories that you wanted to publish but they were shelved? Were there places where you had to rebel, where you had to go against someone? Can you share some of your experiences?
So I remember that I would go to Nepal quite a lot because that time Nepal was a monarchy.
Huh.
And I would cover the struggle for democracy in Nepal. And I would interview all the top political leaders of the Nepali Congress and the Mali and all of that. And again, the women leaders would tell me how male dominated the parties were. So I would try to interview them and get the stories into my newspaper, which was quite a significant paper in Eastern India and Nepal. And I would notice that the male leaders' interviews would get carried immediately,
Ah.
and the women leaders they would say, "Oh, we've already carried one leader on the subject, so why do we need to carry a second leader on the subject?" So I would then have to like sort of say, "I'm not going to do anything else if you don't publish this." Even that was not enough, obviously. So what? If you don't want to do anything else, it's your problem. So then I would write an overall piece on Nepal's struggle for democracy and begin by quoting Mangla Devi Singh, who
Ah.
was the leader of the Nepali Congress in those days, who had been to jail for years, had to keep a family fed while she was in jail, and, a family of 5 kids. But nobody reported that these struggles also matter so much in political struggles as much as a woman's job.
So, how did you actually balance this? Because from what you're saying, what I understand is that everywhere you saw to it that you inserted something that was not supposed to be inserted. So, how did you actually manage it? Was it your writing, the flair for your writing, or was it where you stood? What was it that got you going?
A couple of things. One was that I grew up in a very staunch Gandhian household where, you have to honor each other with the truth. So, truth was a big thing. And it was a household which was part of India's nation building. My father had been to jail as a 15-year-old in India's freedom struggle.
Oh.
So, my uncle was a member of parliament. The house was full of writers and politicians and social workers and activists and journalists and poets. And all were extremely idealistic in that very Gandhian way. So I think I imbibed a lot of things about the idea of truth from them, that you have to stick up for your truth. And also the other thing I learned while growing up at home was nobody would ask me, what are you going to do when you grow up?
Oh.
They would ask me, I would hear conversations with among different people saying, what you're going to do for others. That was the big preoccupation in the house.
Wow.
So, for example, I remember my uncle and Dr. Lohia, Ramanor Lohia, who was also,
Huh.
they were standing on the balcony of their house and of our house in Calcutta. And there would be a woman cleaning the streets outside. And they would be looking out and saying, how much do you think that woman earns? And how much of that earning does she have to spend on food and on rent and on her clothes? So I could actually hear these conversations about empathy, noticing, then turning it into policy. Because then my uncle would go to parliament and say that an average Indian earns only so much money and this money can only go so far. And I saw that happen.
So that's a very different way of conversation. I mean, that doesn't usually happen in households. Now, you've also been instrumental in changing certain laws in the country. So, as a journalist, how did you go about that?
So, because of what I saw at home, I probably didn't see limitations to what I could do, right? So, for me, it was like, I can do anything. And if I don't succeed, I'll try again. Because I saw all these leaders keep trying and failing and getting not elected and losing elections and still winning. And, one person showing up at the meetings and not showing up at all, or having huge rallies also. So, I always knew that I would honor myself with the truth, along with honoring other people with the truth. And that was my journalism. And in a very sexist newspaper atmosphere, my newspaper was very interesting because it was the first newspaper which gave journalists, female journalists, positions which no other newspaper was giving at that
I
time.
see.
So we could be field reporters, special correspondents, bureau chiefs. This was happening for women, the first generation of women who were really breaking stories, right,
Okay.
in India. At the same time, the atmosphere was still sexist, right?
Huh.
Remarks and things like that.
True.
So I learned very early on that to take on this sexism, I developed a superpower, if you will.
Uh-huh.
And that superpower was humor, the art of dealing with bossy men. How can you do that? And you can do it because most of the men in our lives are bossy without knowing it,
Mhm.
right?
True.
And they are people we love, fathers and brothers and uncles and even classmates and college
It's
friends.
considered as, in quotes, care, but it's actually dominance, if you would.
Exactly. So I learned how to puncture them very easily in a very gentle,
Can I have
fun
an
way.
instance?
Ah, so for example, my brother, would he loves to pontificate.
Okay.
So and we are all sitting at this lunch, and he's pontificating in the middle of the lockdown, saying, and we are in our childhood home in a village in Bihar where my book I Kick and I Fly is set, and he's saying that the old ways are the best, and our family is trying to decide which a new washing machine to wash clothes, which one
Okay.
to buy, right?
Huh.
And he says, no, we should not. The old ways are the best for washing machines.
Oh.
Because clothes dried in the sun are better, they use less power, we can save the planet, and he's waxing forth, right? And I said, fine, let's set up a shift system and let's begin with you. And there was a
Silence.
pause. And then, of course, he had to retract. He says, you're taking this too specifically.
So, what better way to, get back to them, I would say.
Yeah.
Well, that's an interesting one. So, coming from journalism, I mean, we've been talking about journalism all this while, and then you made I wouldn't say a dynamic shift, but then I think it was in the offing, writing a book. So, how did you go from journalism to author? I mean, it's both the same, but then the whole idea is different. So, tell us about that journey.
The biggest detour was that as a journalist, I realized that I'm an objective journalist.
Hmm.
And to me, that meant I object. So,
Okay.
so I used to object to anything which I saw was unfair or unjust. And that's why I wanted to be a journalist. And that's what I wanted to report. So I would report, when I was a reporter, there was a woman who committed sati. And then I found out that she was actually talked into, brainwashed into, and finally forced
And
into
which year was
committing sati.
this?
Roop Kanwar. This must be the
90s?
1980s.
80s. Okay.
And I went to her village, I went to her family, and I finally heard that she was crying when she was inside the flames to say, pull me out. But they turned her into a goddess and did all that. So, this is the kind of reporting I wanted more and more to cover and bring forth what this is doing to us, right? And of course, the biggest issue that I faced was, again, it was gaslighting, the gaslighting. That this was like a trivial thing, one off, Roop Kaur, maybe she really wanted it. She was from Rajasthan, she'd been brought up in Ranchi and married to Rajasthan and committed sati there. So I used to explain to people that, it's not okay. And if we don't go deeply enough into this kind of a story, what will unfold in India will be something we won't be able to handle. And, how was she brainwashed into committing sati? How was she talked into it? And why was she not pulled out of the flames if she was crying, help me, when she was in the flames? And this kind of patriarchal structure, which is tied with extreme violence to women, is extreme, of course. But this really portended a lot of things which unfolded in the future of India, right? And I'll tell you one thing. One of the things I've realized when I look around me right now is that it's as soon as we are born that we realize that it's all right for one class of human beings to order and one class of human beings to obey. It's all right for one class of human beings to give approval and one class of
To
human beings
accept.
to seek approval, right?
True.
And so, what gender does is it digs a trench into our brain into which all other inequalities fall. So, we begin to accept that hierarchy is okay. And then when we step out into the world, we accept the hierarchy of caste, of class and other hierarchies because we normalize the idea of hierarchy. We also normalize the idea of a head of the family as the power structure, triangular, right? And whatever decision he takes is fine, whether it's right or wrong.
Hmm.
That's our idea. And so we vote in such a person. All we want is a decision maker. We don't want to know whether he's going to take a right or wrong decision because our comfort factor is that. And so, what we are seeing in the eroticizing of violence and what's happening, the huge sexual assault on women right now, and the cutting of our gender rights, we are also seeing the emergence of the patriarchal family again. It's a big backlash to the emancipation of women. And fascism eroticizes violence. So we must have understand that what is going on is very much connected to the fact that we were not able to address these issues when they were happening. And we talked about equality, and we caused caste upheaval, we caused class upheaval to an extent, but we were not able to cause gender upheaval. And gender is the first hierarchy we experience.
Yes.
So all these kids
They're
who
interconnected.
yeah, they're growing up and normalizing this and now choosing.
And so that's when I think you decided to address your book to kids. Basically, your audience caters to kids in a way. I mean, you could say young adults. That would be more apt, I guess. And that's how I think Kick and I Fly happened, and Hira came into the picture. And it is one read that I think you can finish it off maybe in 6 hours, and it's like a movie. You can visualize every single scene. So from journalism to writing a novel, how was the journey there, and how did Hira, from where did Hira actually sprout? Was it is she a real person, or is she from your a fragment of your imagination?
So the journey from journalism to author took a slight detour, a
Huh.
big detour, and that was via being an activist.
Okay.
I was researching another story in the hills of Nepal when I came across rows of villages with missing girls.
Hmm.
And I asked the men drinking tea and playing cards where the girls were. And some of them responded and said, "Don't you know they are in Mumbai?" Now, Mumbai was 1,400 kilometers away. And I was surprised and puzzled that how could so many girls from these remote Himalayan hamlets end up in Bombay. I followed the trail and I found little girls locked up in small rooms with iron bars on the window for years.
Oh my.
Some of the girls were on display in cages,
Oh.
and I was sad. I was upset. I was angry. I was also determined to do something about it. So, the first thing I did was, as a journalist, tell the story. I made a documentary called The Selling of Innocence. And because of that documentary, I won an Emmy for Outstanding Investigative Journalism. So I was on stage in New York at the Broadway Marquis Hotel. And when I was looking at the audience, all I could see were the eyes of the mothers who had told me their stories in the brothels. And so, in that instance, I decided that I would not use my journalism, I would not use my Emmy to build a career in journalism, but to use it to make a difference. So, I stepped off the stage and I turned to the lady who had given me the award. She was US Secretary of State for Health. And I said, "Can you help me change laws which will punish the traffickers and the sex buyers? And can you help me ask governments to invest more in the most vulnerable girls, the people that Gandhiji called the last?"
Hmm.
And to me, that was the last girl, the 13-year-old in a brothel. So she connected me to people in the UN and the US Senate, and I went and showed my documentary and addressed the UN's delegates, 160 countries, and played a role in the passage of the UN protocol to end trafficking in persons. And then I did the same. I went to the US Senate and testified to the US Senate and managed to get a bill passed, contributed to its passage,
Wow.
now known as the Trafficking Victim Protection Act. And so this became how I began the journey at the policy level. But
Hmm.
I couldn't forget the women who had told me their stories. So I went back to Mumbai with my award and I said, "Here's my award. I've broken the silence and let's hope the world will do more." And they said, "No, no, you have to help us." And I said, "What do you want?" And they had four dreams: school for their children, a room of their own, a job in an office, and punishment of the perpetrators. And that became my business plan because I didn't know how to run an NGO.
And that's how Apne Aap happened.
That's how Apne Aap happened. And it's called Apne Aap because that means self action in Hindi.
Yes.
We called it Apne Aap Women Worldwide because we were organizing locally, but we were connecting with women's movements across the world.
Wonderful. That's a beautiful story. And from Apne Aap, we have Hira coming in.
Yes. So now let me tell you how Hira comes in from Apne Aap. So the first thing we did was we rented a room in an abandoned municipal school in the red light district of Mumbai, hired a teacher,
Okay.
and began to educate the kids for school. Once the kids were ready for school, the principal of the local school said, "No, no, no, I can't admit children are prostitutes."
This sounds like Gangubai Kathiawadi story. I mean,
It is a
the
lot based. I'm sure they have read about my work and they've taken things from there. What I liked about it was the fight for rights and the
right.
pathos they showed and the pain in prostitution. What I found troubling was the way they glorified
Ah,
and romanticized what happens inside a brothel because it doesn't happen. That's not real. And
yeah, about the school.
so
And
the
she said
school
no.
and the principal said no. So we organized the women, and the mothers went in a group and said, our children too. The principal relented. And fast forward, we have community classrooms in Bihar, in Calcutta, in Delhi, in Mumbai. And we've educated more than 3,000 children through school and college and helped 20,000 women, more than 20,000. I've stopped counting now
Ah,
because, data is a game and I refuse to get into that game. So we've helped more than 10, 20,000 women exit systems of prostitution. And one such community classroom was in Forbisganj in Bihar. Forbisganj is a very small agricultural town on the border of Nepal. And there is a red light district which is known as Laltain Bazaar. In
okay.
my book, I call it Girls Bazaar,
Yes.
and it has 72 mud huts, and each mud hut is a brothel plus a home for the family. So one room is the family home and the back room is where the customers come. It's right next to the railway tracks on one side and what is known as the Mela ground on the other
Ah,
side, where a fair comes annually for
and that's where the girls are sold.
where the girls are auctioned
Auctioned.
off,
Yeah, okay.
sold, auctioned off. And so that's where we started our community center and our classroom. And one of the challenges I faced there was to get Hira to school and girls like Hira was that the traffickers would beat up the mothers. The traffickers would threaten our staff members. They would lock up the girls if they came home for the weekend. So we started a hostel to keep them safe, and the traffickers would actually jump over the walls in our hostel and kidnap the girls. So I thought that if this is going to happen and the girls are going to be facing such enormous odds, let me equip them with one more thing besides education. And that was Kung Fu. So I used to go to the community center every day and I used to see a couple, a man and a woman, teach karate to some kids near a rice field. So I asked them, I said, will you come to our hostel and community center to teach karate and kung fu? And they agreed. And fast forward, a girl like Hira from a mud hut where the roof was leaking, her mother was working on the highway breaking stones so she could feed her family. Her father was working for the crime overlord and he was going to sell Hira to the fair when she turned 14. And Hira's going to school, but she's bullied in school because she's from a nomadic tribe, comes from the red light district. She's hungry, doesn't do well in class. And then, she suddenly begins to win gold medals in Kung Fu. And that really happened in my NGO. I began writing I Kick and I Fly when a girl just like Hira won a gold medal in karate.
Wow. So it's actually, whatever you've said. And I think, Rini Di in the book is very much Professor Ruchira Gupta. Am I right? Have you modeled Rini Di much on your character, or is there someone else also of the same kind, or are there many Rini Dis around us?
Rinidhi is a composite character of many feminists I'm inspired by. So part of it is, of course, me, because you always put yourself in a book. Even in the conversations between Hira and Salman, there is some of my thoughts, right?
Yes. Okay.
And the fact that I did start a women's hostel in a children's hostel in Forbisganj is true. That I did start an NGO and run a community center is true. I did learn kung fu for a couple of months in my life. I love Bruce Lee. I love his movie Enter the Dragon and the
Ah,
song Everybody Loves Kung Fu Fighting. Those kids were as fast as lightning. But also, Rini is a composite character. If you remember, after Jyoti Singh Pandey, there were many women leaders who went out and made amazing speeches and marched and rallied and all of that to have stricter laws that would punish those who were assaulting women in a very severe way, right?
Yes.
And so, some of the speeches that Rini gives are also taken from those speeches. And yeah, she's a composite character.
Wonderful. So you were telling me about Bruce Lee now, who's also a very central character somehow in your book, I Kick and I Fly. So Bruce Lee says, "Be like water." So how much is Professor Ruchira Gupta like water?
I am. I'm learning to be like water because I've realized that the forces that are going to take away women's rights, that are going to take away the protection of children, that are going to take away maybe even the idea of democracy the way we know it, which will again impact on my rights as a woman, as a female in independent India, will come under huge assault right now.
Mhm.
And I think the most political thing I can do right now is to survive without compromising. So, honor myself with the truth and honor other people with the truth, and find new ways to recruit the next generation of activists, which is why I wrote I Kick and I Fly, because I feel that with this book, I can reach schools and colleges, and I can reach adults and young adults. In my own life, I realized that there's nothing more powerful than a community coming together around something it cares for,
Yes.
like the mothers in I Kick and I Fly or in my NGO. So, with this book, I'm passing on the baton to all the young people out there that join my movement to create a world in which no human being is bought or sold. And no one has to face discrimination, bullying, sexual abuse, body shaming. All those things should be in the past. They don't need to be. And I want to read you something
Please.
about something from the book about Bruce Lee and his quote. And totally believe that his philosophy, be like water, flow, don't crash, will apply to all of us as we navigate more and more troubled times. So, Hira's in her first kung fu class. The instructions begin: left, right, press your thighs, back straight, shoulders down, breathe deeply. As I relax down into what I think is the horse stance, Rinidhi comes and straightens my back. Don't push your chest inward, Rinidhi shows me. All power in Kung Fu comes from the ground. I try to feel the pull of the earth. I embrace gravity, letting it connect with my body. Somehow it's more natural than I could ever have imagined. Something happens. My body loosens up and lets go. I open up my shoulders instead of slouching over my breasts in shame. I inhale deeply into my expanded lungs. By the time we finish the cat stance, the twist, and the crane stance, I'm exhausted. I can feel every muscle ache, every pore breathe, the shame, the guilt, and the fear that have been embedded in every cell of my body seem to have seeped out of me. I have always hated my body, my breasts and hips, the parts of me that gave me away. They marked me out for the fair in Ravi Lala's eyes. I push my shoulders back and open up my chest without fear. I am calm, though my heartbeat is loud. For the first time, it seems, I notice different parts of my body. Rinidhi says, relax. Remember, Kung Fu is not just about physical strength. It's about channeling your energy or chi to use your strength effectively. What does that mean? I ask. It means your mind and body will connect. You will choose to listen to both unitedly. If a power is stronger than you will become flexible and let the stronger power spend its energy out onto itself rather than on you. We nod. I mull over these words. She leaves us with a final thought. You cannot be powerful all the time, or you will break. You cannot be flexible all the time, or you will lose direction. Be like water. Flow, don't crash. I bow to Sifu, then in all four directions of the Kwun. I will flow, not crash. Namaste.
Wonderful. I seriously feel that this should be part of the syllabus in school so that kids are more motivated to read this and to understand the whole essence of the book, which is basically empowerment, I would say. And you've been through so much. You've definitely had threats on your life, if I've understood correctly. So, how do you continue to keep the smile on your face? Doesn't all this affect you?
It does affect me. And, what keeps me going is the fact that I succeed girl by girl and law by law. So the fact that I have managed to prove my point is very inspiring to me. The second thing is that I have a lot of friends and allies across the world. So the feminist movement has given me a family of choice, along with the family that I was born to. And so I have that support structure around me. I like painting, I like nature, I love reading. So art also gives me a lot of healing and strength as I go along. And I think just a deep inner conviction.
So yes, you used to read Oliver Twist. I mean Charles Dickens and all. And yes, Oliver Twist was one of your favorites, I believe. So how did Oliver twist your life?
I want to be a writer like Charles Dickens. He was also a journalist. He also exposed through literature what was wrong in society. He wrote David Copperfield and Oliver Twist, and that impacted on social change and policy change, not just in England, but across the world. Because people realize that how child labor is bad. People realize how if you give less food in foster care homes, and Oliver Twist gets up and says, "Give me more," and there's a furor, we realize it's not okay to do things like this, right? So they set certain ethical norms for how children should be brought up in society and looked after and protected. I want to do the same through my book, I Kick and I Fly, Hira, and through my other writings in the future. I want to have characters who are 14, 15, 12-year old, and through their voice show society what we need to address. Because after all, it's the young who are going to inherit the earth.
Yes.
And if we don't address it, what's the point of even holding on to this earth?
So as we mentioned earlier, you must have had a lot of threats coming your way. I mean, the kind of work that you deal with is such. So how what was the biggest threat that you faced, and how did you deal with it?
One was that I'm a survivor of cancer,
Oh,
breast cancer. So I had a surgery and the breast is gone. So that was, in fact, less traumatic emotionally because I knew there was a medical treatment for it. The other was when I was attacked by criminals inside the red light district of brothels of Bombay when I was filming. So a man walked in then and he pulled a knife at my throat and said, "I will not let you film here." And about 22 women who I was interviewing surrounded me and told the man that if you are going to kill her, you've got to kill us first
oh.
because we have decided to tell our story. And that's how I was saved. So I realized in that second that here's this power of collective action. These women have saved me before I even began to do anything for them. And they were just 22 women in a brothel.
So, well, as we come to the end of our podcast, I would like to ask you, we've been speaking about your journey all this while and all the different things that you've been through. So, for one final question, the whole thing, how did you, is my question once again. How did you?
How did I? Four or five things I would say. The first is I learned to listen. So I would go to the grassroots and sit with the women because if you want change to happen, it has to begin at the bottom and transform the top. It's like a tree. So your seeds have to be planted in the ground. So that's how I did become an activist, a successful activist, because I listened to the women on the ground. The second reason that I succeeded and how did was I was passionate. I am passionate. So when I do something, I do it as if it matters, big or small, because only time shows if something is big or small, but I have to do it as if it matters. The third is that I have this very strong belief that we are linked, not ranked. So I have challenged hierarchy in every possible way I can to make the world a fairer and more just place.
Well, thank you so much for being with us on Mathrubhumi podcast. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Smriti.